Hey class, I hope everybody had a good Memorial Day weekend. We are continuing with the Renaissance, and today we are talking about this man right here, Galileo Galilei. All right, we've already talked about him just a little bit when we talked about the Medici's, because he was a teacher of their children. So, but he did lots of different things in the Renaissance, or during the Renaissance era. Most famously, he not invented the telescope, but he improved the telescope and started looking at the sun and the planets and all of these different things, and noticed that Copernicus was right, and the Earth revolves around the sun instead of what they believed. So he did a lot of different things. He led a interesting life. He also is responsible for the scientific method, or the idea of the scientific method, because without experimentation, without observation, you wouldn't have that come around. He was one of the first people to do these observations, do these experiments. So that's who we are talking about today. Well, he was born in Pisa, Italy. Pisa, Italy is where he was born. If you look right here, it's circled right here, Pisa, Italy. It's not far from Florence, which is where he moved to whenever he was younger. His father was a music teacher and was a pretty famous music teacher. They moved to Florence when he was 10, and he began his education at the Camaldolese Monastery.
Early life. Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy, where he grew up with his brothers and sisters during the Italian Renaissance. His father was a music teacher and a famous musician. His family moved to the city of Florence when he was 10 years old. It was in Florence that Galileo began his education at the Camaldolese Monastery.
All right. So he was an accomplished musician, and he was an excellent student. And at first he wanted to be a doctor. So he went to right here, the University of Pisa, all right, to study medicine in 1581.
Early life continued. Galileo was an accomplished musician and an excellent student. At first he wanted to become a doctor, so he went to the University of Pisa to study medicine in 1581.
All right. So while he was there, he became interested in physics, mathematics, and if you look at the picture here, he noticed something one day. He noticed that, hey, how far a lamp swung, it always came back at the same speed. All right. It took the same amount of time for it to swing back and forth, regardless. So it didn't agree with the common scientific principles of the day, though. So, he didn't say too much at first, but he started studying things like this.
A budding scientist. While at the university, Galileo became interested in physics and mathematics. One of his first scientific observations was a lamp hanging from the ceiling in the cathedral. He noticed that despite how far the lamp swung, it took the same amount of time to swing back and forth. This observation didn't agree with the common scientific principles of the day.
So in 1585, he left the university and he got a job as a teacher. And he began to experiment with pendulums, levers, balls, and other objects. And he tried to describe how they moved using equations. And then he invented this thing right here. It was called the hydrostatic balance. I know it looks kind of complicated, but it would go down. I can't explain how it works exactly, but it go down, and it's one of the first inventions that he made.
Budding scientist continued. In 1585, Galileo left the university and got a job as a teacher. He began to experiment with pendulums, levers, balls, and other objects. He tried to describe how they moved using mathematical equations. He even invented an advanced measuring device called the hydrostatic balance.
This right here is the hydrostatic balance. So scientists were a little bit different during these days, okay? They're not like scientists we know nowadays. All right, what they did, they studied the works of classical philosophers such as Aristotle, here pictured over here to the right, and but they didn't run experiments or tests. They just believed their hypothesis or their beliefs to be true. So this was the beginning of the scientific method, though.
The scientific method. During the time of Galileo, there weren't really scientists as we know them today. People studied the works of the classical philosophers and thinkers such as Aristotle. They didn't run experiments or test out the ideas. They just believed them to be true.
Galileo had different ideas, though. Okay, he wanted to test these theories. He wanted to test these principles and observe them in the real world. So, and this concept to the people of his time laid the foundation for the scientific method. This is the scientific method right here. All right, it laid the foundation for that. He was one of the first to do these experiments, to test these theories that he had.
The scientific method continued. Galileo, however, had different ideas. He wanted to test the principles and see if he could observe them in the real world. This was a new concept to the people of his time and laid the foundation for the scientific method.
All right, so he conducted this experiment on the Tower of Pisa. All right, where it was believed that if you drop two items of different weights, one would land further or first before the other if it was heavier. So he wanted to test this theory out. So he went up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and he had two items of the same size, but they were different weights, and he dropped them. All right, and it proved something wrong with what they thought before, because instead of landing at different times, the heavier one landing first, they both landed at the same time, which means that the gravity was pulling it the same. So this was it tested out, and it disproved what they had thought.
Tower of Pisa experiment. One of the traditional beliefs was that if you drop two items of different weights but the same size and shape, the heavier item would land first. Galileo tested this idea by going to the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. He dropped two balls of the same size but different weights. They landed at the same time.
All right, so it made some people angry because, hey, they didn't want the traditional views to be questioned. They didn't want them to be questioned. So in 1592, Galileo moved from the Pisa University to Padua, where he was permitted to experiment and discuss new ideas without much interference from the higher-ups.
Tower of Pisa continued. Galileo's experiment made some people angry, however. They didn't want the traditional views to be questioned. In 1592, Galileo moved from Pisa to the University of Padua, which was permitted to experiment and discuss new ideas.
All right, this right here is Copernicus. He was an astronomer who lived in the early 1500s, and he came up with the idea that the sun was the center of the universe instead of the earth. All right, and it was different from the current belief that the earth was the center. So Galileo began to look at Copernicus's work, and he said, hey, I support this. I think the sun is the center of the universe, but this opinion was highly, highly controversial. And we'll get to that in just a little bit, because when he goes to show evidence of all this and everything, the Catholic Church is not pleased at all.
Copernicus was an astronomer who lived in the early 1500s. He came up with the idea that the sun was the center of the universe. This was very different from the current belief that the earth was the center. Galileo began to study Copernicus's work and felt that his observations of the planets supported the view that the sun was the center. This view was highly controversial.
And that's right here. This is Galileo's telescope. All right, this is one of the things I said. He didn't invent it, but he improved it. All right, he improved it and made it to where you could see it even better. All right, he heard of the invention from Holland that was called the telescope, and it could make faraway items appear closer. So what he did, he made improvements to the telescope, and soon his version of the telescope was used throughout Europe. So this is one of the things he viewed the planets with. He viewed planets and studied the planets and the solar system with.
Telescope. In 1609, Galileo heard of an invention from Holland called the telescope that can make faraway items appear much closer. He decided to build his own telescope. He made great improvements to the telescope and began to use it to view the planets. Soon, Galileo's version of the telescope was used throughout Europe.
So he studied the planets and the sun, and he became convinced that the Earth and other planets orbited the sun, and he wrote this book. The book was called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, and he described why he thought the Earth orbited the sun during this time. But, like I said, the Catholic Church was not too happy about this, all right? And you didn't mess with the Catholic Church back then. We've talked about that during the Middle Ages and a little bit with the Renaissance. You did not go against what it said, what their beliefs were, because if you did, you were going to get in trouble, all right? So they looked at it, and they considered Galileo's ideas as heresy, all right? And at first, they sentenced him to life in prison. If you look down here, this is life in prison, all right? But they later allowed him to live at his house in Tuscany under house arrest for the rest of his life. So, but they did sentence him to prison at first for heresy.
Prison. As Galileo studied the planets and the sun, he became convinced that the Earth and other planets orbited the sun. In 1632, he wrote a book called The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. In this book, he described why he thought the Earth orbited the sun. However, the powerful Catholic Church considered Galileo's ideas as heresy. At first, they sentenced him to life in prison, but later allowed him to live at his home in Tuscany under house arrest.
All right. And there he continued to live for the rest of his life while under house arrest. And in later years, he became blind, and he died on January the 8th, 1642.
Death. Galileo continued to write while under house arrest. In his later years, he became blind. He died on January the 8th, 1642.
All right. All right. So our first question: where was Galileo born? Was he born in A, Pisa, Italy, B, North Carolina, or C, Scotland? He was born in Pisa, Italy, right here, not far. He moved to Florence when he was 10 years old.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, number 2, what measuring device did Galileo invent? What measuring device? Did he invent A, the printing press, B, the hydrostatic balance, or C, the sword? He invented the hydrostatic balance whenever he was conducting experiments and measuring, coming up with equations.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 3, what did his ideas of observing and experimenting lay the foundation for? A, the scientific method, B, the Pythagorean theorem, or C, the printing press? It is A, the scientific method. What we know as a scientific method today, he laid the foundations for that with his ideas and his observing and experimenting.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
Number 4, what did Galileo improve and use to view the planets? A, a sword, B, the printing press, or C, a telescope? It was the telescope is what he used to view the planets, and he found out about it from Holland, and he improved it, made it better.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
And number 5, what did the Catholic Church do to Galileo because they thought his ideas were heresy? A, they put him in prison, B, nothing, or C, they hanged him? A, they put him in prison, which later they let him go on house arrest for the rest of his life, but they put him in prison to begin with.
Ding, ding, ding. We have a winner.
All right, class. I hope this is helpful, and I will see you all on Thursday with another lesson. So y'all all have a good day.